Charlie, back again. Great to see you.
And you, Charlie, how was your weekend? Did Chelsea win for once?
They did.
I thought I noticed there was sort of weird absence of whining and whinging in London.
So how about that AFCON final on the weekend? Players leaving the pitch because they disagreed with a decision.
Unfortunately, when something like this happens, other teams start to think that's an option. The only relevant retrospective action would be for them to lose the trophy.
Oliver Glasner talking about being abandoned by a board who, by all accounts, if I look at it, have actually stuck by him in a multitude of ways over the past year and a half.
I thought he sounded totally mad and deluded, and if I was another club who had been thinking about hiring him at the end of his contract at Palace in the summer, I'd be having second thoughts right now. We've discussed before the value of legacy. How valuable is tradition? So Ferrari have got a colour. It's so pervasive as their brand, but there's even, I'm told, a lipstick called Ferrari Scarlet.
This is the great reveal of this week, by the way.
I'm told by my wife that there is a lipstick called Ferrari Scarlet. So once you start disintermediating that by putting ugly sort of interposed other colours, to what degree at some level are you starting to chip away at the pristine sense of history and legacy? Craig Tiley, the tournament director of the Australian Open, has said this week, "Not one player has shown any dissatisfaction to me about what we are doing. I'm not really concerned anyway, as I know the facts." What facts does Craig Tiley know? I'll tell you what he knows.
Charlie, back again. Great to see you.
And you, Charlie, how was your weekend? Did Chelsea win for once?
They did.
I thought I noticed that.
Chelsea won.
There was sort of weird absence of whining and whinging in London, so I sort of assumed that Chelsea had won.
It's one. I think we'd won 1 in 9 before this weekend. So great to see us get on track. Nice to see young Liam get a win. Who I saw was the first manager to play his first 4 games in 4 different competitions. He will be, because Chelsea played Champions League this week. So he will have had FA Cup, the great Charlton game. He played League Cup Arsenal, Premier League at the weekend, and now he goes Champions League.
It's sort of one of those data points that's just utterly meaningless.
It's completely meaningless. But I found it really interesting. And Liam,
I mean, only
delighted.
a Chelsea fan would find that interesting.
Well, look,
Still, there we go.
We're grasping onto the small.
Let's move on.
Okay, well, let's move on, because to kick off, Charlie, we have. I don't want to call it a naughty step, but
well, no, it is a bit. This takes me back to my days on Fleet Street, and there'd be a note on my door note on my desk in the morning from the in-house barrister saying, "Come and see me now." And it normally meant that I'd managed to get something into the newspaper that somebody had complained about. And in this particular case, I said something last week that somebody has justifiably, I might add, complained about.
I did for the defence. We're using quite a few numbers in this thing. There may be the odd occasion where we do get something wrong. The main part was that Prem Rugby attendances are just a little bit higher than what we were told.
I'd say reasonably substantially higher. So in passing, in the discussion on R360 last week, when basically we were making the point that we didn't think that R360 had a chance of succeeding and that Premiership Rugby would be absolutely fine, I mentioned in passing that average crowds were around 8,000 in Premiership, and Premiership Rugby very reasonably got in touch to point out there were in actual fact in excess of 13,000. So we have put the record straight, Charlie, and I shall endeavour to try to sort of scrabble back my journalistic training of 25 years ago to try and keep the errors to a minimum.
And just because it made me laugh when the message came through. How old was that article that you found?
It was this century.
Borderline. But no, look, we do appreciate it. Thank you so much. We want to give the right evidence. And the best thing about doing these weekly is if we do happen to make a mistake, we can rectify it pretty quickly. Anyway, firstly, it's not going to take a full topic, because I don't think we could actually talk about it without that much emotion. But, I mean, how about that AFCON final on the weekend? I mean, a quite extraordinary scene to see players leaving the pitch because they disagreed with a decision and, in my eye, not get disqualified from the match.
Yeah, the rules are clear. You forfeit the match. If the team leaves the pitch without the permission of the referee, you forfeit the match. Them's the rules. And I think the thing about, I'm not some pettifogging rules guy in general terms in life. But when it comes to sport, professional sport, which is played effectively in a way where everyone is aware of the rules, and before you enter a competition, you sign something saying, I sign up to the rules of the competition. Now, I haven't seen AFCON's particular rules, but I'm pretty sure that they will not be different from other rules in world football, and they will say that you start and finish both halves of football and indeed any extra time at the discretion of the referee. And if you decide simply to leave the pitch unilaterally, you forfeit the match.
So do you think the fact that Sadio Mane didn't leave the pitch?
Well, I think probably because he knows the rules.
But therefore it wasn't total desertion, i.e. the whole team
I'd have to go and have a look at the detail of what the AFCON rules are. I mean, in different competitions I've played, you can do things like say, okay, well, look, if various of your players do leave the pitch, if you think about it this way around, let's just say that during a match, a player feels a bit of a tweak and the player walks off the pitch to receive treatment, right? Which would be infinitely preferable to the usual, which is rolling around in a heap on the pitch to try and get treatment on the pitch and stop the game, is just to move off the pitch to get some treatment. It does still happen, not as much as it used to, but it does still happen. What occurs in the match when that happens is effectively the match just continues without that player, because that player has voluntarily left the pitch. So effectively, probably what should have happened is the ball should have been just put on the centre spot,
on the penalty spot.
On the penalty spot in this particular case, the ball kicked into the open net. The ball then put back on the halfway line, and then the referee takes the course from there. So unfortunately, when something like this happens, other teams in other competitions, and going right down into, to be pompous about it, going right down into youth football, other teams start to think that that's an option. Right, that is a way of disrupting the match and putting pressure on the match officials and putting pressure on the whole situation. Because effectively, if you think about how goalkeepers in elite football try and put pressure on the penalty taker, what they try and do is they try and extend the period of time between the penalty being awarded and the penalty being taken, knowing that the pressure will mount on the penalty taker during that time. So, I mean, it would be the same with a golfer putting, right? If a golfer knew he had a 4-foot putt to win the Masters, and you said, right, stop. Now let's take 25 minutes out for you to have a good think about that 4-foot putt. He would be more likely to miss it.
He didn't help himself, though, did he, with that penalty?
He didn't help himself. That is absolutely true. Anyhow,
look, you're right. They can't set a precedent. I think it'll be interesting to see if there's retrospective action, because to your point, if they allow that to happen, it gives other people the idea that this is an acceptable way to act. I mean, if you're FIFA, if you're a big international governing body, you're looking at this going, we cannot have this.
But the problem is what retrospective action fits, because effectively the only relevant retrospective action would be for them to lose the trophy. Any other retrospective action is kind of somewhat meaningless, because realistically for Senegal, the biggest trophy they're likely to win is AFCON, right? So if you were to say, well, we're going to sort of ban you for a few matches of this or that other competition, they say, well, yeah, but we still won AFCON, right? So they're still being rewarded in some way. So I think it was the way it was dealt with, or the way it was not dealt with, was extremely unfortunate, and I hope we don't see it reoccur. Anyway, I think on to more substantial matters.
I think so, because we have a great lineup today. We're going to have a bit of football, we've got a bit of tennis, and we've got a bit of F1. So covering some major bases, but I'm most excited for our first topic, because we're going to have a slightly different style to this. And we're going to have a nice little debate. You've got some great stories in your past executive operational background that are going to throw some light on a debate that's going on right now. And I've heard it a lot on TalkSport, it's been in all the papers, and that's about the manager versus the medical department and where the control should lie for player fitness and their availability for selection. Now, Neil Warnock, I heard on TalkSport. I'm gonna drop the accent. I was
Charlie,
really keen for it.
You can't. No, I did stipulate when you mentioned the Warnock. I said you've got to do this in a Warnock accent.
And I thought I can't think that.
Okay, you can't.
And deliver the points that I want to make, because I'm up against a ferocious opponent here. This has been a massive topic for discussion, and it feels like one of those debates where football's quietly kind of changing. We've mentioned the manager's power in a lot of ways. Maresca came back into this because he had issues with not controlling the availability of the players, and that became quite an extraordinary case of circumstances when he came out and talked about it, which generated a lot of this discussion. Now, I must admit, I find it very interesting to think that you can have accountability without authority. A manager is the one that gets fired at the end of the day, not the physio, not the medical department. They're the ones that the fans come to and go, why is that player not playing? So to say that the medical department is going to have the final say on who is selected and who is not, to me, seems quite extraordinary if the manager is going to be the person having to take the brunt of fan critique, of fan fury.
Well, okay. So let's I'm just going to push back on a couple of things there. First of all, whilst it is true to say, of course, that managers often do get fired, they don't get fired because this or that player has or hasn't played, they get fired normally for losing matches. Now, they might very well say, well, the reason I did lose that match was because this or that player was not allowed to play for medical reasons. But generally speaking, I think it would be unusual that a manager sacking had come about so quickly just because of one or two disagreements in this area. So people in the medical department do get fired. It's just you don't hear about it. Fans don't hear about it because it happens behind the scenes. And quite often, they will be fired somewhat at the manager's behest. If the manager feels that he does not trust a key part of his or the club's performance department. We call it performance services, right? Performance services covers medical, physio, sports science, strength and conditioning, and that person is at a well-run club, very senior within that club. Now, the question is when it comes to this critical area of determining whether an athlete will or won't be training on a particular day, and then subsequently, of course, therefore, whether he's available for selection, because if he's not available for training, then he certainly should not be available for selection. The question is, who makes that judgment, which is a judgment being made purely on physical grounds? Is it somebody who is medically qualified to make that assessment, or is it a coach? Now, that's really what we're looking at here. Now, there are some instances where the decision is obvious. The player has a broken leg, he's got a cast on, he's hobbling around on crutches, everyone is aware that player is unavailable for training. It's very clear. There are other instances where it's equally clear that even though a player has a small problem, physical problem of some kind, that player is fit to play. So the issue really comes more in these very specific moments, and it's all to do with what we call the measurement of load and the interpretation of that load as to whether a player is likely to become injured or more injured if he were to train or subsequently play. And this is particularly in relation to soft tissue injuries. So we're talking about hamstring muscles, calf muscles, quad muscles. All of these types of muscles are the areas which come under debate, right? So in other words, what's happening here is that the players are being constantly measured in everything they do. So when they're training and when they're playing, they have what we call a wearable on, which tracks all of their movement, their power output, etc. And then you've got sports scientists measuring when those outputs start to tail off and start to come down. And that's what we call likely to be entering into the red zone, which means that player's physical performance is starting to deteriorate because his body can no longer maintain those power outputs and those physical outputs.
Does there need to be a 100% for these players to play? Because that's where it becomes difficult to me. Are we looking for perfection? They need to be absolutely at the optimum to be able to participate, because that is virtually, if you listen to players, they'll go, I was literally never 100%.
No, it doesn't work that way. So basically what you look at is it's like risk management, okay? So in a functional club, you'll have a meeting which is between the technical director, the head coach, and the performance director. And they will be looking at the physical state of the playing staff as a whole and looking at risk metrics, which include that player's previous proclivities, right? So there'll be certain players who've got a long history of soft tissue injuries. Reece James at your favourite club would be one, for instance, where you might be well advised to be a bit more careful. There'll be others who really are reckoned to be what we call robust, right? Which means that generally speaking, they play through these moments, they get through them, and you might just go a bit more lightly on training with those and just take the load down and the amount of work they're doing in training down for a few days, and then they recover quite quickly and bounce back. Now, the critical thing is in that meeting, which is assessing all of these things, ultimately, when it comes down to one of the key grey area decisions, who has the final say? Is it the head coach? Or is it the performance director? Or is it the technical director having listened to both the performance director and the head coach? The functional way is the final way, where the technical director says, I've had a look at the assessments of the performance department. I've taken on board what the head coach has to say. I've taken on board the particular situation we're in. So you might be in a position where you've got a particularly important match this Saturday, but for the 2 weeks after that, it might be an international break where the player can take some time off. So there are lots of different considerations.
You didn't mention players once there, which makes me think that, now we're...
Self-reporting of players is a total disaster.
But elite players have always managed their risk to an extent.
No, you can't do that. No.
You infantilise them.
No, you don't. So, you don't infantilize them. What happens is this. different players have, first of all, different levels of pain threshold, number one. And secondly, they are at different points in their psychological moment in terms of their situation within their career and within the team. So what you will find is you will have one player who has, let's say, a quite low pain threshold and who is got on a long-term contract, and he'll be saying on a regular basis, yeah, I'm feeling something. And the physical side will be going, we've had a look at everything. There's nothing there. He should be pushing through this, right? And there'll be another player who has perhaps lost his place in the team, who's feeling a bit insecure, who's coming towards the end of his contract, and the physical department's saying, big red flashing lights here. He's right at the end of, he's in the red zone. He's going to break down soon. And the player says, I feel great, right? And that is just normal. Now, including the player's feedback, of course, it's not. So if you look at what the medical department does, what they'll normally do is they'll have a mechanism, a software mechanism by which when the player wakes up in the morning, they will straight away be required to communicate to the medical department how they're feeling. How did I sleep? How do I feel? You know, do I feel ready to train today? So all of that information is part of the mix. But if what you're saying is, do we just say to the player, if you feel ready to play, then you shall play.
No, but it should be part of.
It is part of.
Right?
It is part
so
of.
Their opinion still matters.
That feeds into the performance department. The performance department will, of course, hear from the player because the physios who are at the front line of this, right? What will happen is the players come in the morning. They'll mostly go into the physio room to have a bit of a rub down, to talk with the physios, etc. And a lot of the information that's gathered during that moment is then what gets pulled into the central process. The physio will then say to the performance director or the head of sports science, I've just had so-and-so in, he's feeling a little bit in his hamstring, you know, we need to have a closer look at this. And it's not as simple as player says I'm fit to play, manager says I want to play him, just play him.
This is just further erosion though of manager authority. If a player knows that a manager isn't the one that is making the final decision on his fitness, the power shifts.
Well, that's a fact that managers don't have, in most cases, the final say on whether a player is fit or not. They are not qualified to make that opinion. You're talking about assets here, which at Premier League level are worth 50 million, 70 million, 80 million, and the lack of alignment between the head coach and the club in terms of time horizon. So in other words, let's say that you've gone and signed a player for 50 million in the summer. The manager then comes under pressure and thinks, well, I might lose my job in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm just going to play this player into the ground because I think he can give me something in the next 2 or 3 weeks, which might help save my job. That could then lead to a 6-month or even longer than that layoff for that player, which is terrible for the player and his career and terrible for the club, even if in the very short run it might have helped the manager in some sort of way. So this is just one of these areas where having a proper functional structure and the technical director being able to take into account, of course, the short-term pressures of needing to win games. Technical directors are under pressure to win games as well, by the way. I mean, you know, when it comes to someone like me as a chief executive or an owner, if we're not winning games, the first person who I lean on is the TD, saying, hey, you put together this squad, you advise on the appointment of the manager, why aren't we winning games? So the technical director can see both sides. He's normally there for a longer period of time than the manager, both good and bad reasons. Managers leave if they're successful because they go and get offered bigger jobs elsewhere, or if they're not successful, they leave. TDs tend to have more of a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 year time frame in the job. So in other words, they can see that actually having a long-term injured player is going to cause them a problem down the track.
Is this model, this increasing shift towards the medical staff having that power, is that pressure from above? Is that a recognition of what you just said now? You're really talking about multi-million pound assets, key parts of a business. And if they do get an injury that terminally impacts them, and there are, you know, a number of players who you can look at in the past who have had those type of injuries and then completely eroded their value. That's the worst case scenario from a business perspective for some of these owners. So can you just let a manager run?
Also from a performance perspective, right? When we bought Charlton were in the relegation zone of League One, which is a terrible place for Charlton to be because at the time they had the 6th biggest playing budget in League One. So they were probably one of the 4 or 5 worst performing clubs relative to budget in the entire English football pyramid, which is why we were able to buy them for a cheap price, because they were in a terrible state. Now, when we did the analysis on why this was, a lot of the media and sort of former managers and fan belief was, quote, poor recruitment, right? Because it always is. That's just what people reach for as the automatic explanation. When we looked into it, we realised it was impossible to judge Charlton's recruitment over the previous 5 years because they had the worst soft tissue injury record in the whole of English football. they would have, on average, 7 players out with soft tissue injuries at any one time in a squad of 22 or 23, right? Now, there are other injuries on top of that, impact injuries as well. We're talking about purely soft tissue injuries, which are the ones which you would say you should be able to largely control, right? That was the average, was 7 at any one time. So effectively what happened was we decided that the biggest single difference that we could make to this club was to sort out the performance department. So we recruited the number 2 performance, the deputy head of performance from Brighton. He came in. He not only restructured those departments and made them more functional with clearer reporting lines, but he also informed us quite quickly that the biggest problem we had was that the drainage had collapsed underneath the training pitches, and that this had led to different textures of ground, and the players, when they were training, which is, don't forget, the players do much more work at the training ground than they do on the main pitch, which they only play on once every 2 weeks normally. They're training on the grass at the training ground every single day. So they were going from firm ground to soft ground to firm ground to soft ground, because effectively the drainage meant that there was no consistency in the turf at the training ground. So we were then landed with quite an unpleasant bill, because we were told unless we ripped up all the training pitches at Sparrows Lane, which is Charlton's training ground, and replaced them, we would not be able to fix this soft tissue injury problem. So that was I think it was a 450,000 bill, which is not something you get any applause for. None of the fans go, wow, that's a brilliant new signing. No one goes, that's absolutely fantastic. So we put these down, and the functional systems were now in place to have a proper performance director with a strong structure, with the appropriate internal meetings with the head coach, etc., etc. In the year that Charlton got promoted, Nathan Jones used 19 players. So they went from having the worst injury record in the league to the best injury record in the league, right? And that is purely by putting in place somebody with authority who is absolutely clear that his job is to provide a fit squad for the head coach to choose from. And that's on him.
Did Nathan Jones buy into it completely?
Look, there were basically yes. But of course, there are moments of tension. Of course there are. And that's why you need a strong structure, and why you need people who have got enough respect for each other to be able to have those conversations and acknowledge sometimes one person will win, sometimes the other person will win. So it's not a question of saying that every single time that the performance director says this player shouldn't play, that happens. I'll give you another example, is actually when you're going through the recruitment process, right? So the player arrives for a fitness test. And sometimes that, in my experience, that had been quite a sort of slightly notional thing. Look, run up and down the pitch a couple, he looks okay, that type of stuff. That was thoroughly overhauled, and we went into doing much more thorough pre-signing fitness testing. So all of these things need to be taken into account if you're going to end up in a situation where you're able to keep a squad of 23, 24 first-team professionals fit and capable of performing. Because actually that is the thing which is most likely to affect whether you are outperforming or underperforming your budget. And I know it's all very unglamorous, it's very like tradey and that type of stuff, and it's not the type of sexy stuff that really gets fans excited. And then they can sort of get drawn into these rather sort of binary sort of like, who's the doctor to tell the manager who should be able to play, etc. It's not like that. It's about rational discussions based on evidence which are in front of you. If there is a scan saying that there is a muscle strain, and the doctors say that that is a risk of getting worse if the player plays, it is not risking somebody else's authority to say that player shouldn't play, in my view.
The technical director surely looks to someone else to blame. In this model, if you're saying you go straight to the technical director,
under what circumstances?
Under the circumstances of losing matches, maybe increasing pressure starts being put on them from the fans because certain players aren't available. I'm sorry, and I'll just use Chelsea because it's the one I can use. But for example, Cole Palmer took 6 weeks, I think, before he pretty much played 90 minutes from playing his first minutes on the pitch. Now, you look at that and you'd go, was that overprotection? Was he capable of coming back fully and playing some of those 90 minutes in core matches?
Well, I think once a player has been declared fit for selection and the player is in the matchday squad,
then it's the manager's.
Then it's on the manager.
Okay.
Then and I would not be supportive of a situation where you started to get people interfering with the manager's decision-making process during the match. Now, what will quite often happen is there'll be discussion internally. And to say how common this is I was having a discussion last Friday. I was in Belgium at my Belgian club, and I was having a discussion with our head of sports science there and our head coach, George Boateng, and we had a player who'd come back from a little while out. This is his first match back, and the sports science head goes to George, I think probably 50 to 60 minutes, George. And George goes, okay, yep, That's good. I've got him back 50 to 60 minutes. If that's what you're saying, I want to make sure that he's available to me for the rest of the season. So that's absolutely fine. So these things are not always flashpoints. These things are not always touch points. If you've got the right people in the room who are in the right mindset, who are being bound together by the right culture, then it doesn't need to be antagonistic. I'll tell you one thing which I have seen in the last week, which I do think is a fair charge, is that in an environment where more and more authority is being vested with the technical director, right? Why is the technical director not more media and public facing, and why is he not more obviously accountable for what the outcomes are, right? Because he also appoints or is heavily involved and responsible for appointing the head coach as well. So even if the head coach is struggling and failing, fundamentally that's down to the technical director.
It's a good point. So, I have, on our other show, I think we've probably had between, I don't know, you being one of them, 15 Football League, English football chief executives, maybe 20. Yeah. I have tried on multiple occasions to get a technical director to come and join us and have a conversation. And you know what it's like. We're not exactly sitting there skewering people, right? No. You get a very fair run.
Yeah.
Nothing. Now, I've asked that question quite a lot. Why? Why? When you see these people now making such key decisions, why are they not the ones capable of coming and having this conversation?
So I think it's quite cultural. In foreign countries, the TD does speak a lot more.
Germany's good at it, right?
Germany, absolutely. Yeah. In Germany, very much so. In this country, so funny, I sort of go back to Charlton because it's my most recent experience in English football. But I've done the same in Belgium. When we started at Charlton, our TD was quite media-facing. But when things started to go a bit wrong, as they often do, which was very much in the early days, before a lot of the changes we've made had a chance to bed down, he basically became the whipping boy for the fan base, right? Which, I guess somebody has to be, right? But effectively, the TD is somebody you're trying to bed in for the long run and trying to get them sort of in that medium to long-term frame of thinking, because some of the decisions that they're going to need to be making are about medium to long-term. So I think there's a sort of cultural process. I think that the first bit of that cultural process is happening, which is fans are now starting to understand that whether they like it or not, the technical director is a very powerful person within their football club. And then the fans, not unreasonably, many of them are saying, if you listen to phone-ins and this type of stuff, we now want to hear from the technical director. So I do think this is reasonable, but there is probably going to be a bit of pain in between where fans are going to find it, or are finding it, very, very challenging. And I can feel it in your voice as well, in your body language, that the old gaffer in his sheepskin on the sideline with his little black book of contacts and his little tap of the nose and his brown envelopes to the agents, that there's a bit of the fan that doesn't want to let that go. Yeah. But as owners and directors of the club, we want to let it go.
This feeds into a second point I know you're desperate to touch on, but it really all comes back to a shift in the role of the manager, and a manager being in a position now to have the confidence and authority to know what they know and be fully accepting of what they don't.
Klopp was the master of this. Klopp was the absolute master of this.
Dr. Ian Graham's influence on that team, as we both know, when you have those conversations with him.
Charlie, it's so interesting. If you read Ian Graham's book, How to Win the Premier League, which I would highly recommend to anyone listening to this podcast, one of the best books about football I've read in the last 5 or 10 years. And Ian Graham, Dr. Ian Graham as he is, who was a Cambridge academic who then came into data analytics and then came into football data analytics off the back of being a normal data analytics, ends up becoming the head of research at Liverpool, who drove a lot of their recruitment processes working to Michael Edwards. After leaving Liverpool, Ian wrote this book called How to Win the Premier League. And the really interesting thing was the difference in his relationship between Brendan Rodgers and Jurgen Klopp. Brendan Rodgers basically didn't want to know. He basically said, yeah, you guys have your numbers, whatever. There's this player who I used to manage at a different club 3-4 years ago. I just want to sign him, and that's it. I don't care what the numbers say. I just want to sign this player. When Klopp came in, it was much more a case of you guys are spending so much time looking at this and so much time looking into this that by definition, you're going to know a lot more about it than I do. And therefore, my input is going to come like right at the end of the process, which is once you guys have come up with somebody who you think is going to make a difference, do I agree? Right? Which is a totally different mindset, and the reason, and I think that's the core reason that drove 5 years of Liverpool's success was these functional structures and relationships that were put in place by Fenway, but also the the character type of the people in those relationships. You know, these were strong characters. I mean, anyone who meets Jurgen Klopp knows he's a very strong character. Anyone who meets Ian Graham, actually, Ian is quite a strong character. He's not a quintessential nerd at all. But their ability to be respectful of each other's space and understand that they had a job to do to try and bring the other one on board and try and get the best out of each other, and Michael Edwards indeed overseeing that entire relationship, is exactly what I'm talking about. It doesn't need to be unpleasant. It doesn't need to be aggressive. It needs everyone to be supportive of each other.
The best leaders always talk about the value of the people they have around them and bringing people in who know their trade. And in football managers in particular, historically, you have had that holistic control. And it's worked in maybe the way the game was, but without all the data that we have now, without all the technology, it's a big shift from the egos of managers. But we see it come out in lots of different ways, and we can't talk about managers and power shifts and everything without referencing some quite astounding, incredible language, I think, used by Oliver Glasner at the weekend with the sale of Mark Guehi going through just before the game that they played, and him talking about being abandoned by a board who, by all accounts, if I look at it, have actually stuck by him in a multitude of ways over the past year and a half and given him the greatest success on his CV.
I thought he sounded totally mad and deluded. And if I was another club who had been thinking about hiring him at the end of his contract at Palace in the summer, I'd be having second thoughts right now. This is the type of stuff that, as boards of directors, this is the type of stuff we look at, which is, as well as being a good head coach, is this person going to be able to be a good corporate citizen? Is this guy going to be a team player? Is this guy going to be part of it? Let's just examine the situation. Glasner has been there 2 years. The Crystal Palace project, which led ultimately to them winning the FA Cup, the first major trophy in their final in their history, and then qualifying for Europe. Don't forget, they should have been the Europa League, but because of the whole Textor problem, it ended up being the Conference League. That has been a 10-year, 15-year run, right? A project that's been built up over a long, long period of time, and the club is unrecognisable now to what it was then in terms of its facilities, in terms of its processes, in terms of the quality of every single thing it does. If you go to the Crystal Palace Academy now, and I have been recently, it is right up there with the big six. It is absolutely terrific. And not just in terms of facilities, but also in terms of what they turn out, right? They're also producing lots of great players. So this is a board and an owner in Steve Parish that knows what he's doing. Now, I've had disagreements with him in the past. I think his and Karen Brady's decision to oppose the deal which the Premier League had done with the Football League was dumb, and it led to the creation of the football regulator. That he and Karen Brady are why the football regulator has happened, right? If they'd actually agreed to let the deal with the Football League go through 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the government would have dropped the football regulator. Effectively, it was them saying, we're not going to do that deal, that led to the government saying, okay, right, we're going to have a football regulator since clearly you guys can never agree on anything, right?
Well, isn't it a 14-6?
It's a 14-6 split, and effectively West Ham and Palace managed to get enough other teams on their side to block what was effectively a redistribution of TV rights. So it was very much led by... So I'm not sort of just saying that this is a perfect guy who I agree with, but you cannot gainsay the fact that he has taken a club which had been in administration and in league, in Championship, but in danger of going down to League One, and is now a mid to upper mid-table Premier League club which has just won the FA Cup, deservedly so, and which is quite possibly going to win a European trophy this season. And he's done that by making calculated risks along the way. And two of the risks came from either just around the time that Glasner joined the club or just before. And those risks were not selling Mark Guehi and Eberechi Eze, who were the two best players in the squad. We need to remember the history on this, right? Just to be fair to Steve Parish and the Palace board. In the summer of 2024, Newcastle offered Palace £65 million for Mark Guehi. Palace turned it down. And by the way, Guehi had been bought for £18 million from Chelsea. Right, so it's not like he was some youth player and, well, you know, a significant amount of money had been paid for Guehi, and they turned down 65 million quid for him a couple of years ago. Eze had also had offers on him. Parish has turned down £100 million worth of offers for Eze and Guehi in order to enable them to be a full part of the squad last season. And the risk paid off and they won the FA Cup, and that has now made Oliver Glasner's career as a manager. And now, 6 months later, obviously Eze went last summer. He went for 65 million quid to Arsenal, and Guehi's gone for 20 million obviously he's out of contract in the summer, so it would have been zero. In 4 months' time, it would have been zero. These are full England internationals, Gahey and Eze. They're not like internationals who have played 1 or 2 games as fringe players in a friendly. They are core parts of the competitive England squad. And the fact that Palace and Glasner had them for a year and a half to 2 years of his tenure at Crystal Palace is an unbelievable tribute to Palace's ability to hold their nerve and hang on to their best assets to try and achieve something glorious, which they then achieved and which has now been thrown back in their face by an employee who they pay £4 million a year. I thought it was absolutely outrageous.
I just find abandonment an absolutely extraordinary word in that context.
There was such he's not even under, Glasner, the thing is, quite often people excuse bad behaviour by managers as saying, well, he's under intense pressure. Glasner is not under intense pressure. His contract finishes at Palace at the end of the season, and he's refused to sign a new contract at Palace, right? So in 4 months from now, everyone knows that Oliver Glasner is going to be leaving that club. Everyone knows that Palace is going to finish somewhere in the mid-table this season. They're in no danger of being relegated. Probably, given all the games they've had to play in Europe, etc., they're not that likely to hit the top 8 either, top 7 or 8 either, right? They're going to be a mid-table team. He's got a phenomenal achievement on his CV of winning a major trophy with one of the non-top 6 clubs in England. We've got all the biggest clubs looking at him as an option, right? Thinking, oh, quite, this guy could be the next big thing, etc. And then he goes and does this. If I was his agent, I would just have my head in my hands and just be just say, oh my God, he's just blown the big job.
Look, you get players of those qualities, and unfortunately, whether you like it or not, and I'm sorry, Palace fans, it's a selling club at that level. Can you imagine Andoni Iraola sitting there going like this, having had multiple players at the top level sold to major European teams? There are so many examples of this, and it's very easy for us to criticise boards and structures.
You can't criticise Palace's board here. They have given up 45 million quid on Gahey to keep him there an extra year and a half.
Yeah,
that's a fact.
Powerful stuff. And a good place to leave it.
Yeah.
I think. Let's move on from football and move into tennis, because as always happens in middle of January, you kick off the year with the Australian Open. And I'm excited for this year of tennis in general. We had such dominance from Alcaraz and Sinner last year. They've won the last 8 Grand Slams. Since 2023, wow. They have won the last 8 Grand Slams.
I've seen all the games, but I guess I haven't strung it together like that. Perhaps it's something to do with the previous era. It was so well established that they were the big 3. And obviously everyone knows it's now the big 2, but perhaps the level of dominance by those big 2 hasn't yet fully penetrated the non-tennis specialist sort of world. But yeah, 8 in a row. Extraordinary. Extraordinary.
The last 3 competed against each other.
Yeah.
Alcaraz winning 2 and Sinner winning 1. And you look at this now, and tennis for so long, its biggest problem was a succession plan, wasn't it? It was looking at those magnificent years that we had for 20 years of Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, in particular those 3. You then had players like Murray and Wawrinka coming in and stealing a few great Grand Slams off those guys. But we really had a concern of whether tennis could hold that audience when that passed on. How important do you think it's been to have 2 people at the same time, similar ages, coming in and creating not just great tennis, but also great theatre? How important is that to sport?
I think there were big concerns in tennis. I know there were big concerns in tennis for a period of about 3 or 4 years towards the back end of the Nadal, Djokovic, Federer era, when they were concerned that pretty much they would all leave the stage at around the same time, and there wasn't really, they'd been so dominant that they hadn't really allowed anyone else to have enough oxygen to grow. And then just at the moment when they were coming towards the end, suddenly, bang, Sinner and Alcaraz come up together at pretty much the same age, straight into a massive rivalry. So you're like, wow, tennis have dodged a bullet there. Tennis has really dodged a bullet. And I think if you look at it, and even on the women's side with Sabalenka, so you just look in terms of the top stars at the moment on men's and women's side, it's looking pretty healthy in terms of capturing public attention. Because I always say that for sports globally, leaving aside the US sports for a moment, because that's very specific to one country, in terms of the global sports that the rest of the world plays, if you're not football, you desperately need to have some characters at the top of your sport who transcend the niche audience that your sport already has and takes you onto the general sports interest stage. That's when the big bucks really flow. And I think, it's just moving towards the stage now where people who aren't necessarily big tennis fans are aware that Alcaraz and Sinner is a thing. right? And hopefully over the next few years, that just becomes a bigger and bigger thing. And hopefully one or two other players, as happened in the previous era, manage to get close enough to them to not make the semi-finals an inevitability. You want at least the semi-finals to be close, right?
I think, yeah, of course you do. And if you have one concern right now, it would be the gap between total dominance at the top between those two and what the rest of the player group are able to contribute. But it also brings in the really interesting look at the broader player finances within tennis. And
well, it's a big controversy right now, isn't it? I mean, it's really blowing up right now, actually, at the Australian Open.
Well, firstly, the Grand Slams pay the most money across all of tennis. The interesting thing about tennis is the events outside of the Grand Slams, in comparison, don't actually pay a huge amount. We're talking about $1 million maybe for the top ATP 1000 series. And then if you're going to the US Open, up to about $5 million.
This is for the winner.
For the winner.
Yeah.
Now, the Australian Open, in comparison of all the Grand Slams, I think this year is about $2.8 million for the winner. But we're still talking about significant prize money throughout. You're still talking about $28,000 if you lose in the first round. You're talking about $500,000 if you get to the quarters. So players in these systems are still being remunerated very well. There is still a big discussion point around whether the distribution of revenue is sufficient for the impact and the quality of what the players bring to the product. And what I mean by that is the numbers basically net out at between, let's say, 16 to 20% of total revenues across these Grand Slam weeks go to the players. And the players argue this isn't enough. In comparison, we're going to use points like the NBA, where we have a player revenue share model where the success of the players is tied to the success of the league. They get about 40 to 50% of those revenues distributed to the players. So you have a group of athletes here basically saying, we are the key assets you have. We're independent contractors. We go and participate. We bring you lots of money. And you are not sharing the spoils of that anywhere near to the extent we think we're valuable for. And let's look at those numbers and whether we think a proportional spread of that revenue going to the players at a 15 to 20% is sufficient for the influence that the players have in generating the money, considering you've just highlighted that a key part of attraction, a key part of elevating the sport to that global audience, beyond just a tennis fan, is the stars. And it actually throws light on a broader governance issue, I think, within tennis, which isn't talked about too often. And that is the fragmentation that sits at the top of the game.
Right. Now, I've got a belief in tennis and golf that the majors are, the Grand Slams, whatever, are different from the rest of the year. These sports need their big stars during the rest of the year, because during the rest of the year, it is by no means a given that anyone will give two hoots about whatever tournament's happening that week. So let's say, for instance, in a few weeks' time, they'll come over to America and they'll play Indian Wells and Miami, which is two big tournaments in the US, outside of the slams, two of the very, very biggest tournaments. During those weeks, the amount of noise that tennis will generate will be dependent on, first of all, what else is happening in the world of sport, but also on things like, well, you know, Alcaraz, Sinner, Sabalenka, all this type of stuff. During the slams, it is an absolute given that tennis will generate a vast amount of noise, right? These are just huge events. So what we're coming on to here, I think, is an estimation of like how important is any particular individual player to a Grand Slam event when that Grand Slam event is so huge and so big and generates so much noise that actually whichever players are playing is somewhat less important than would be the case in a normal tour event, right? Because as you quite rightly said, the Grand Slams sit outside of the tour. The different bodies that you mentioned, Charlie, you've got the individual Grand Slams. So Tennis Australia owns the Australian Open. The All England Club owns Wimbledon, and so on and so forth. These are standalone events. Then you've got the ATP Tour, the WTA Tour. Then you've got the governing body, the ITF, the International Tennis Federation. So the interaction of all these things is pretty complex and probably would need, first of all, more time than we've got today, but would also need somebody from the tennis industry here to really, who's been behind those closed doors to explain exactly how all those bodies interact. But what it comes down to is, I think often don't. So Madison Keys, one of the female professional players,
defending Australian Open champion,
said 2 days ago, as we are the product, it makes sense for us to be partners, right? Which exactly encapsulates what you've just said. I now want to read out what Craig Tiley, the tournament director of the Australian Open, has said this week. Not one player has shown any dissatisfaction to me about what we are doing, brackets about prize money. I'm not really concerned anyway, as I know the facts. What facts does Craig Tiley know? I'll tell you what he knows. First of all, he knows that with a prize money fund of $75 million US compared to a normal tour event about 10 million for a major sort of serious tour event, that it's highly unlikely that any player is going to make the decision that they are going to miss the Australian Open and instead focus on normal tour events. However much their resentment might be about that they should be getting even more, an even bigger prize money fund from Tennis Australia for the Australian Open.
Because for here, you're jumping to the eventuality. It's like, well, this can run on for as long as you want, but until, are you really going to not play in these events because you're so dissatisfied?
Ultimately, this is like the golf question, right? Now, and I know that you're keen on the golf comparison. That the moment this came up, you were like, this is like Liv. And I'm like, well, actually, it's the opposite of Liv, right? Because when Liv golfers were making the jump, what they were het up about was about what their tour was doing, right? They weren't complaining about the majors. They were complaining about their tour. And they were like, we are members of the tour. In fact, pretty much we own the tour because it's called the US PGA Tour, the US Professional Golfers Association Tour, and the tour itself is not giving enough of its revenue that it does generate to us. In jumping to Liv, those golfers who were jumping to Liv, their biggest single concern was to make sure that they could still play in the majors. Because the majors, which stood apart from the US PGA Tour, which also, by the way, do not contribute anywhere near as high a percentage of prize money as the normal tour events do, still pay much more than even the Liv Golf events pay, because they are absolutely vast. And because I think the golfers had enough self-awareness about them to know that if they were to say to the Augusta committee, yeah, I'm really annoyed about the prize money, I'm not going to play at Augusta this year, they know what the response would be. Okay, do one. Fine. If you don't want to turn up, we won't invite you. Go. Yeah, you go and play in some event which no one's watching, which has no relevance for your future career. So my view is that whilst you're right in saying that there is a serious, intense debate going on at the moment, the question I'd be asking the players is, are you serious about this? Are you actually serious about this? Are you serious about trying to gain some leverage and use that leverage by trying to damage the Grand Slam events? Are you willing to give up a couple of years, both in terms of creating your legacy in terms of how many slams you win, but also, frankly, in terms of prize money? Carlos Alcaraz last year won just over 20 million. Sinner won just a bit less than 20 million. Of that prize money, more than half was won at the slams. So basically, if they were to say, well, we're not going to play the slams because the slams aren't paying us enough money, well, if the slams then held their line on that, then their earnings would halve, right? Because there's no suggestion that the tour itself is generating enough money to suddenly pay them vast amounts more. The tour itself is, I think, struggling even to pay the purses that they do currently pay. So I'm just not quite clear that the tennis players have got as strong a situation as you think.
I hear everything you're saying. If we're looking at them as direct comparisons, which you've expertly just explained and kind of pulled apart there, I, again, agree with you. I'm taking a step back and I'm looking at a sport that I love, that I'm really passionate about, just like golf. I've always been a huge fan of the people at the top of it, the athletes, the stars. And if I'm watching it, I want to see the best people playing. And those rivalries in tennis are almost some of the best things in sport, I think. It crosses over. When you get them, they are absolutely incredible to watch. Some of your biggest mouth open moments.
Because it's direct combat. It's direct combat, isn't it? Right?
And it's just the blows. Like Alcaraz and Sinner in the French Open last year, when Alcaraz saved 3 match points.
It was mega.
You're just looking at it going, this is the most incredible thing.
It was mega.
What I don't like, and my comparisons to Liv that I'm making, are these organisations that are running these sports, turning a blind eye to it, seeming indestructible to the extent where it doesn't really matter what they think because we know we have the power. Yeah. And ultimately, whether it works or not, the player's getting to the stage where something like a Liv happens. They are, any sport which has its key stars as independent athletes is vulnerable to external disruption. Yeah. Now, whether it's been good or bad for golf, whether it's succeeded or not, Liv has not created
bad for golf and not succeeded.
Liv has created a negative environment. You're looking at this and you're going, what could happen with tennis if they just basically shut the players down. The Professional Tennis Players Association that was set up by Novak Djokovic and Vasek Pospisil was specifically done to try and give the players a voice. They figured if we can band together and present ourselves as one, it's not a union, but it is in as many ways. Then we have a much better chance of doing this. Now, I'm not worried about the top of the game. And you mentioned Sinner and Alcaraz in there. And they are extraordinary and they're going to make millions and millions no matter where they play. Where I get more concerned about it does this argument get a little bit stronger as you go down? What I like about it, and you and I had a brief discussion, is that if we actually looked at where this money was being spent by the Grand Slams, it's in grassroots, it's in communities, it's going to great places.
It is.
We're not looking at money being fluttered away on high transfer fees and sacking managers, if you could do it in football.
No.
So it's a really important part of the tennis ecosystem.
It is.
But making a living as a player outside of the top 50, maybe even the top 20.
I would say,
I'd say
that outside the top 20 or 30
is incredibly hard. Dominic Thiem sat here and said it costs $1 million to become a professional tennis player at that level. That's the level of funding it takes. So you're already in a sport that requires a huge financial injection. It's huge costs that you have to cover when you're traveling around the teams, your physios, your nutritionists, your departments behind the scenes, which no one sees. And if you lose that and you just create that part at the top of the game where you have a few people succeeding but nothing underneath, you're going to dilute eventually a product where right now, if there's any concern, as I said, I'm a bit worried about viewer fatigue. I'm a little bit worried that this just becomes dominant to the extent where my interest wanes until maybe that final, because nothing underneath that can support itself. So the question I would ask is financial distribution sufficient to maintain a level of competition outside of the biggest players that reach the last 4 to 5 days of these tournaments?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I just had a look and see what the number 20 players on the men's and women's side earn, right? $2 to $2.5 million a year. Right. Now, take the tax out of that and take the traveling expenses out of that and take the coaching expenses out of that. I mean, it's very back of a fab packet, but I'm going to reckon that those two players, who are the 20th best players in the world in a sport which is one of the very few sports that is, first of all, truly global, but also quite democratic. I mean, most parts of the world, it's not that expensive to play tennis. Golf can be a bit more challenging, etc. So these are people at the very, very top of one of the biggest sports in the entire world. They're 20th in the world. So if even the number 20 in the world is, during what is inevitably a reasonably short career, not really making the type of money that enables you to put aside a whole heap for retirement and that kind of stuff, then I think you've definitely got a distribution problem. And I think if the Players' Union was coming forward and saying, do you know what, Carlos and Yannick are doing great here, and they're fine, and they're okay with it. They're not the ones complaining, and Sabalenka's not complaining, etc. As a union, though, we are concerned that the 50th best player in the world basically can't make ends meet. And we want the Grand Slams to be putting a little bit more in every single year to try and make sure that enough of it gets spread throughout the professional game to enable a flourishing ecosystem. I think it would be so hard for the Slams to argue against that, because effectively what we're arguing for here is that money will be that the Slams contribute their profits to grassroots tennis. The problem with that is that it's grassroots tennis in the countries which host the Slams, right? So it's not being contributed to grassroots tennis over the whole world. It's being contributed to grassroots tennis in the US, England, France, and Australia. So for the players to really win this argument, I would be saying, we want some of that money that's currently being spent on the grassroots to be distributed further down the pyramid of the professional players to enable a broader, flourishing professional game, because that'll strengthen all of us. I think it'd be quite hard to argue against that.
Rabbit holes. Maybe the bigger thing here we should talk about when the ATP season starts is why that's not bigger than it is.
That's a huge topic, one to come on to for another day, I think. Perhaps once we're into the tennis season, once we're into one of those periods of the season when we do have...
Really interesting to look at.
Yeah.
Maybe you should go and buy the ATP tool.
I'm barely able even to buy a lower league football club, let alone
you being all of you watching who may have the funds to have done a European tour style investment rather than...
It sounds like a 20 VC gig to me.
Oh, good. Don't
see if you can persuade Harry about that.
Yeah, but I mean, tennis is fascinating. I love. It'll be really interesting to see how this unfolds, I think. And also more broadly, shout out to the Australian Open for doing some really cool stuff. I don't know, we'll finish on it, but that 1 point slam, like making it more content friendly, I thought some of that was really fun.
That was super cool. I'd say my son is currently traveling in Australia, and he sent me a picture one day of him with Kyrgios, who is a real sort of Gen Z hero, anti-hero type figure. And then the following day, just him walking, and I said, what's it like? Because I've never been to the Australian Open tennis. And he said, Dad, this is mega. Yeah. He said, this is absolutely huge. Like, this is so much... He said, this is so much more fun than Wimbledon, right? He goes to Wimbledon every year. He said it's absolutely terrific. So, it is, of course it's about the players, but we have to also recognize that Tennis Australia are doing a phenomenal job. They've actually turned it into effectively a 3-week event.
It's an event, yeah.
It's a festival. 3-week festival, which is, super job. It'll be interesting to see the financial numbers that come out of it this year, because I think last year Tennis Australia made something like 700 million, big numbers.
It's great to see.
Okay.
Topic 3. The brilliant world of Formula One. And the reason why we're doing this week is because I'm sure some of you will have seen, and especially if you're a fan, it's the big week where a lot of the liveries are announced. So the design of the car for the upcoming 2026 season. Now, you may think, this is a weird thing to discuss, but when you actually look at what the liveries represent, you get into the core economics that have established the sport. And what I mean by that is the incredible commercial growth that the sport has seen. Up to $3 billion nearly was the rough estimate. And bear in mind, you're looking at teams and F1 Centrals. And a huge part of that, I think around 2, was attributed to the teams. And a huge part of that is how those brands are then presented on the cars. And the reason I was quite keen to talk about it was because it fed into a conversation I had at the start of this month with CMO of Revolut, Antoine Lenel, who was talking about their new title partnership with Audi F1. And he ran through a number of reasons why they selected Audi as the partner that they most wanted, and made it very clear they were approached by a number of F1 organizations as well.
Yeah.
But everything from the relatability of the brand, the premium but accessible brand, the color schemes, what they represented coming into F1 as like a challenger.
Being a disruptor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Brought some really interesting discussion points, and the F1 community jumped on something that he said because it referenced, should we say, an aesthetically poor example of a sponsorship being at odds with the core fundamentals of Ferrari's brand when they put HP, a blue brand, on the red car.
I mean, aesthetically misplaced, but not. You wouldn't say that HP and Ferrari are a particular brand disconnect in general terms. Right? HP is a massive established software provider, and Ferrari is a massive established car provider. It's not like there's a brand disconnect in that. You can see why HP would choose Ferrari as their natural partner rather than a disruptor, because HP aren't a disruptor.
Hence why livery is so important. So while the partnership made complete sense and the financials were excellent, what people were talking about was the negative aesthetic of the car.
But from
blue
HP's
on
perspective,
a red car.
From HP's perspective, is it not the case that the fact that people were talking about it at all is a really powerful thing?
Who's it bad for? I mean, that's the question.
Well,
right?
Who's it bad? I mean, the answer is
probably not great for Ferrari.
That's the question, isn't it? It's a trade-off here, and I think we've discussed before the value of legacy, right? How valuable is tradition? How do you put a value on it? Because you're trying to effectively forward project and do a counterfactual going for the next 10, 20 years of saying, would we lose significant more money in future were we to become a bit less credible as a brand? An example I want to pick up here is the most commercial sport of all, the NFL. So the NFL do not have shirt sponsorship. Now, the moment I say that, everyone will go, yeah, it's true, actually. But when you think about it, it's unbelievably surprising. Everyone thinks about the US sports, and particularly NFL, as being the most commercialized of all sports. And a lot of people who are football, soccer people are very concerned about, well, when we go to America, are they going to try and turn it over commercialize it, etc.
So is that why Chelsea don't have a shirt sponsor? I've been wrong all along. I'm sorry, I apologise.
It's a heritage play.
It's a heritage play.
It's a heritage play.
The great history of Chelsea is being
It's a heritage play. Yeah. So the NFL, I know that the NFL has made a decision that the long-term value of NFL will be greater than the short-term cash that would accrue to it by putting sponsors on the shirts. It was a massive call, because you imagine what those sponsorships on the shirts would be worth across 30-odd teams, right? I mean, you're talking about billions of revenue every year that the NFL is deliberately giving up because they have decided that they are so protective of their heritage and the look and feel of what the NFL means to people that they almost at any price they don't want to give that up. Right,
it's a 120 billion broadcast deal, I think it currently is now, that is probably made more valuable because of those types of values.
Right. See, it's these detailing, right? So let's go back to Ferrari. So Ferrari have got a colour that is so pervasive as their brand that there's even, I'm told, a lipstick called Ferrari Scarlet. Sorry, that came out.
Yeah.
I suddenly realised just while I was saying that was going to come out just terribly. I am told.
This is the great reveal of this week.
I'm told by my wife that there is a lipstick called Ferrari Scarlet. So that is how, so when you're even thinking about sort of, house decoration and paints and all this type of stuff, there is something called Ferrari Scarlet. So once you start disintermediating that by putting ugly sort of interposed other colours onto Ferrari Scarlet, to what degree at some level are you starting to chip away at the pristine sense of history and legacy that Ferrari has? Now, I did a little bit of research on this, Charlie, and I found out that actually, speaking to friends of mine in F1, that Ferrari actually raced in non-scarlet in, I think, the 60s. They were like, there's nothing new for Ferrari not to race in red. You should have a look at this car that, John Surtees was driving in the 50s or the 60s. And I was like, and I looked it up and I'm like, oh, God, you're absolutely right. That's really interesting. But in a way, that doesn't matter. Because when you think about motor racing in the 50s, at that point, it's not a legacy product. It's quite a new product at that point, right? So it hasn't built up that brand yet, which it now obviously has done. So the question is, Ferrari, if you're running Ferrari or running the race team or thinking forward, for the next, you're the Agnelli family, thinking forward for the next 10, 15, 20 years or whatever it might be, and you're wondering, what's more important? Is it the $80 million I'm going to get from that particular sponsorship? By the way, it wouldn't be $80 million or nothing, because clearly you could get another sponsor for less that would be more look and feel appropriate. Or actually, am I better off turning it down and banking the long-term credibility of the brand? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that it's a question of objectives, and the question that you asked about who it's good for is a really interesting one.
I'm just going to read out the statement made on the birth of this partnership between Ferrari and Hewlett-Packard. Right? Can we just make sure that we keep a camera on Charlie's face while I read this out? The partnership will also entail a shared commitment to advance sustainable innovation and accelerate purposeful technology.
What? Charlie, can you tell me what that means, please?
Blah, 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 $80 million check, thank you very much, is what it means.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is we talked about corporate comms last week, didn't we?
We did.
That is the most classic
If I compare that to what Revolut said,
Oh.
I'm buying Revolut, right?
Oh, completely.
Revolut smashed it in terms of, hey, these guys are cool guys. Audis are cool guys. They're disrupting F1. We're kind of like that in the banking industry. We're all together in this. We've got the same kind of values. And everyone's like, do you know what, actually? Yeah, fair shout. Fair shout. That feels about right. That there just feels like, come on, guys. Don't take us for mugs.
If you're going into that partnership, HP want to maximize their exposure. Hence why they're sponsoring. They're sponsoring the hottest sports asset right now. They've got some brilliant ones as well. They've got Real Madrid. They're creating this portfolio.
Real Madrid sleeve, yeah.
Exactly. Sorry, sleeve. They're creating this portfolio of top assets. Ferrari's an amazing one to do. So you understand why they do that deal. If you're Ferrari sitting there, you're going, I'm loving this because, as you said, the check's great. But the one thing we have to continue to protect is our heritage, is our values, our cause, and red is now the fundamental of that. I also think it's interesting when you look at some of the biggest deals in Formula One, and this was part of Antoine's point, and you suddenly go, actually, yeah, those title sponsors, they're quite closely aligned, just from an aesthetic branding perspective, with the teams that they partner with. MasterCard, supposedly nearly $100 million McLaren, kind of orangey, yellow, and red.
But that orange thing, Charlie, is quite recent. I mean, for my time working in Formula One, I will say that there is a significant difference between when I was advising the Formula One Teams Association, and therefore you were dealing with all of the teams all the time. There were basically two different types of teams. One of which is what were called garagistes, which built up by British engineers and mechanics on their own as independents, right? So you're talking about Williams and McLaren and so on and so forth, Eddie Jordan and these types of guys. And then you had the factory brand mark teams, Ferrari, Mercedes, sometimes Toyota, sometimes BMW, Audi now, et cetera, who were basically backed by massive corporations who are getting into F1 in order to try and sell more leisure cars, right? That's what they're trying to do. So if I'm one of the latter category, and I am trying to build this brand to try and sell loads of really expensive cars, the whole integrity of that brand is hugely meaningful to me, because that's part of a much bigger picture. If I'm one of the garagistes, right, so one of the independent teams that's basically having to try and make sense of their business pretty much from racing, I know McLaren does also sell, cars well, but basically a race team, then I can be a lot more like, well, we can kind of change our legacy and heritage a bit as we go along here. So, I mean, when I was young, McLaren did not race in orange. It was red and white because they were sponsored by Marlboro. And they actually basically looked like a Marlboro red fag packet, right? So and that was
like Nicky Lauda's cars, and yeah. But I mean, that's your point of they were in the early stages of discovery in a sport. They didn't have the association.
Yeah, but that orange, that colour that they're currently sporting is a relatively new thing, is what I'm saying, right?
But I think, and maybe I'm wrong, I think that this big partnership, I think, was signed since they became orange. So
absolutely.
So whether you're looking at, again, you're looking at the alignment.
Yeah.
Santander was, I think, a partner when Lewis Hamilton was driving, and it was that kind of very, like, it was that metallic silver and red on the car. Petronas and Mercedes has the kind of silvery association. I know that obviously Mercedes have gone black and that kind of changed, but Oracle and Red Bull, very simple. Now, and the reason I'm using these ones is because they're the main title sponsorships. If you want, they're the biggest ones. They're $60 to $100 million a year deals,
which is roughly equivalent, by the way, to Premier League shirt fronts. Yeah, it's a similar area.
Yeah, exactly. Because quite often we look at pounds, right? 60 to 70 million pounds is generally the top going rate for the top Premier League clubs.
And here we're talking about $80 to $100 million.
Exactly.
So it's similar kind of thing.
It's interesting because you're looking at those numbers and you're questioning, therefore, how much of that value is derived from the representation of that brand on the car. You want to be synonymous with your team in so many ways now because they always talk about the alignment that extends beyond. But the touch point, right, as a fan, I want to be on that car. Yeah. I want to be seen to be that sponsor when Lando Norris wins that world title associated directly. So the livery game, I think, is a really interesting part of it. It's the billboard part. Yeah. It's a key financial driver of it.
The commercial side of Formula One is absolutely fascinating. I think at some point, probably around the time of the start of the season, or maybe around the time they do testing, I really want to get into the cost cap, right? Because the cost cap is what has transformed that industry. Because I think that when you look at how that cost cap was devised, how it is working, and everything around it, and then you compare it to what's happening in football, I think we can draw some really interesting parallels there. Well, that's a big subject for another day.
It's what made the teams investable. But I would say the move, just to finish off, you look at some of these brands coming in now, and it's been fascinating. You mentioned Marlboro. There, being a key one. There was alcohol brands, ironically, with driving. It was all of that stuff.
Philip Morris is still a sponsor of Ferrari, I think.
And so's what was it? Jack Daniels is on the McLaren car right now. I saw that.
Nothing wrong with that.
I didn't see that at all. But then, the Revolut piece, you had OKX coming in, you had Airwallex as well. There was about $500 million plus of new kind of fintech coming in. So it's interesting seeing the categories that are now really putting themselves in that market, that are recognizing that this burgeoning sport is now somewhere that we really value and want to be placed. And most interestingly with Antoine as well, just to finish, I thought it was fascinating when he really talked about how they valued it. Being a global brand, the fact that Formula One is in 17 of their markets meant he could split that cost, that 8-figure, maybe 8-figure cost between 17 different markets, suddenly making it a far more palatable deal on the bottom line of that marketing budget. But for now, I think we should probably leave it there, because otherwise we can run on endlessly, like I know we always like to do. And I don't know about you, I feel less knackered today.
I don't know. I'm looking forward to lunch.
Look, Charlie, as always, thank you.
Okay.
Great chat.
Cheers, Charlie. Thanks a lot.